الحمد لله نحمد الله سبحانه وتعالى ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah, welcome everybody. The topic I wanted to talk about today revolves around what occurred in Marrakesh, and I think some of you are aware of it, but for those of you who aren't, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, who I think in many ways represents a type of intelligence that has been lacking in our community in a lot of different areas. He's somebody who doesn't study, for instance, usul al-fiqh as a historical artifact, which a lot of scholars today do. They study usul al-fiqh as a historical artifact, trying to understand how our tradition emerged and evolved. He studies usul al-fiqh, and I think he's arguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Sunni master of the tool of usul in modern times. He studies it as an actual manual, really, of operation, an operating manual that enables us to use our religious tradition in a way to make it compatible with the circumstances that we find ourselves in, not compromising it, but recognizing that circumstances have their realities. He calls it fiqh al-waqi', the jurisprudence of reality, that reality, ad-darurat laha ahkamuha, like the fuqaha say. Necessities have their own categories, their own rulings. And we have many, many examples of this historically throughout history of the Muslims dealing with their circumstances. I'll just give you an example. Historically, when Muslims conquered lands, there were two types of ways that they came into a land. One was what was called unwatan, and the other was sulhan. So unwatan is where people refused the Muslim demands, and so they fought it out, and then the Muslims won. That had a whole set of rules that went with it. And then if they conquered them under a treaty, like a sulh, then that also they were able to stipulate things. So one was like a conditional surrender, the other was like an unconditional surrender. And you see this in early Islam. One of the things in unconditional situations that they would not allow them to build new churches. And so you will find, for instance, that there are periods where a ruler will come and he'll actually order the churches to be torn down that were built in the previous administration. So you'll find that in our history books. And these are things that a lot of people that are very anti-Muslim are pulling out, because they're going into our sources and looking at our history books. And what's interesting about their methodology is that they will cherry pick all the things that blacken Islamic history and just, they will look at them as simply fact. This is fact. And anything that puts the religion in a good light, they will say, oh, this is clearly a contrived story. It's a nice story told by Muslims to make their religion look nice. And this is a very common, when you get into Orientalist tradition, it's a very common motif. For me, it really bothers me a lot, because they don't challenge a lot of these narratives that I personally would challenge, because the Prophet never destroyed a place of worship. And so and he prohibited destroying places of worship. So if a Muslim ruler destroys a place of worship that was already built, even if it was built against certain codes or legal restrictions, if it's being used by a religious community, I don't believe the Prophet would have done that. And so to say that this somehow is normative Islam because a ruler did it. Another aspect that we have to remember as Muslims is that Islam was a religious tradition that our Prophet told us would only have a polity for 30 years. And then after that, he said it wouldn't be Islam. It would be something else. And so after 30 years, and it ends with Hassan ibn Ali's Khilafah, which lasted for 6 months, almost to the date, 30 years after the Prophet ﷺ, his death, it aligned with empire. And Islam becomes now a vehicle for empire with all the aspects that entails. Just like Christianity in the 4th century aligned with empire. So the first 300 years, the Christians had a certain tradition, but after that, when they aligned with empire, it became very different. One of the fundamental debates in early Christianity was about wealth. This was actually a more significant debate than a lot of the theological debates that will enter into the religion later on. Could a Christian be rich? That was a major discussion. Many of the church fathers really felt, and the Desert Fathers certainly felt, that the only way that you could truly express a true Christian faith was, in essence, to completely remove yourself from the world. But once Christianity became the religion of an empire, it changed, it transformed. And Islam is the same. You can't divorce the scholars that worked with empire and their decisions and their reasoning from the environments that they were in. You can't separate those two. And then you will find historically the vast majority of the scholars that are honored in our tradition, the vast majority, not all of them, but the vast majority of them had very tenuous relationships with empire. Many of them would not visit rulers. They simply would not go and sit with them. If the ruler wanted to see them, they would say, he has to come and see me. I'm not going to him. Imam al-Ghazali, who in his early part of his life was very much aligned with empire. He worked with Nizam al-Mulk. He was in his coterie. But when he had his transformation, he went on his pilgrimage. At the tomb of al-Khalil, he swore an oath that he would never visit a ruler. That's an oath, another, that he actually swore. He vowed that he would never visit a ruler. And when he was called to the court of Sanjar, he went not believing it was breaking the vow because he was forced to, because he was accused of, of religious heterodoxy, and he had to go defend himself. But he did not, after that, engage with rulers. And so there are many, many examples of that historically. Malik ibn Anas is a clear example of somebody who, and Abu Hanifa and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, all of them, if you look at the 4 imams, all of them were simply not tied to empire. They would not allow themselves to be compromised in that way because they understood that once you ally with empire, you compromise yourself. And one of the interesting things about our legal system is that judges traditionally were independent. So even the rulers could not control what we would call the judicial branch in our separation of powers, because we separate legislative, the judicial, and the executive branches based on Montesquieu's demarcations. In the traditional Muslim world, the legislative was largely an independent body, the fuqaha. And you had the executive branch, which would also legislate things very often against the fuqaha, the independent legislative branch. So they would legislate taxes that the fuqaha considered unacceptable or unjust. So the legislative branch in Islamic history was actually an independent branch generally, but it was also co-opted by empire. And so there was a tenuous relationship between the fuqaha, what they called the ulama of sultan, and the ulama of Quran. right? So, as you know, as we look at usul al-fiqh as a tool to deal and grapple with the real contingencies of time, that's something that I think Sheikh Abdullah takes very seriously. And this is why he's come up with certain conclusions about things that, and they're very troubling to some of the ulama, which is interesting also because one of the things that he does is whenever he comes up with something, he always writes his argument from an usuli perspective. He puts it out there, and then it's like, if you have criticisms, write them, and then I'll address them. And this was our traditional adab al-ikhtilaf. Like, you put forward your argument, because one of the things Van Doren said, and I think it applies equally to our tradition as it does to Western civilization, is that inheriting a tradition is inheriting a lawsuit. So when you inherit a tradition, you're grappling with different lawyers of the past making arguments. And just to give you one example, in the verse which is in Tawbah, where it says that they're supposed to pay jizya, حَتَّى يَدْفَعُوا جِزْيَةً عَنْ يَدٍ وَهُمْ صَاغِرُونَ, right? So there's the jumla hali as وَهُمْ صَاغِرُونَ, that they should pay this tribute in a humbled manner. وَهُمْ صَاغِرُونَ. If you read the books of fiqh, you'll see amazing things. Some of them said, oh, we have to humiliate them. And so this is not from prophetic practice. This is their interpretations of a verse in the Quran. So they would say they should pay it at 12 p.m., 12 noon, the hottest part of the day. They should pay it without their head cover. They should always put their hand, offer the money like this, so the Muslim takes the money from above, because yad al-ulya khayru min yad al-sufla, right? And the hand over is better than the hand under, meaning the one giving is better than the one taking. So in this case, you know, they had to offer the money like that instead of like that. That's one view, and the fuqaha, you'll find that in the books. And these are the things that these Islamophobes pull out of our books and say, well, there, look at this tolerant religion. And then you have people like Abu Ubaid in Kitab al-Amwal, one of the great fuqaha of Islamic tradition, who argues that just paying tribute is humbling enough. So honor them and treat them well and don't humiliate them in paying their tribute. So there's another faqih who comes up with a completely different approach. And so what is it? Which one is it? They're both from the quote-unquote tradition. And this is the lawsuit that we inherit. And then we have to ask ourselves, what is closest to our Prophet's behavior? How was he with people when the Christians of Najran came to Medina in according to one recension in the 9th year of Hijrah? How did he treat them? According to our books, he let them pray in the masjid. When they debated with him about, for instance, Ya Ukhta Harun, they said about Mary, you've confused Mary, the sister of Moses, with Mary, the mother of Jesus. Because in the Quran, Mary, the virgin, is called the sister of Harun. And the Prophet said, wasn't she an Aaronite? Because the Aaronites were the shrine keepers. And Mary was from the offspring of Aaron, the brother of Moses. So he was explaining, because the Arabs say, Ya Ukht al-Arab or Ya Akh al-Arab, when you're from a people, you call them the sister of that people. So she was an Aaronite. So he was saying, that's not a confusion. That's an epithet that indicates her lineage. So he explained, he didn't say off with their heads, how dare they question the Quran, how dare they question my prophecy. No, he treated them with respect. He debated with them. And then when the debate was going nowhere, he challenged them to the mubahala, which they decided not to do after consulting with the Jews in Medina. He said, we'll not do that. And they entered into an agreement with him, and they moved back, and he sent an arbiter with them. So there's an example. So the point being is that You're going to find this in our tradition. You're going to find all of these. We've got 1,400 years of tradition in the same way the Christians have 1,400 years. They have 2,000 years of tradition. The Jews have 3,000 years. It becomes cumbersome. Tradition becomes cumbersome. Hence the Protestant impulse. Let's just do away with all this stuff. Let's go back to the original sources. And that's hence Salafi da'wah is so appealing to a lot of people, because it's just saying, let's go back to the book and the sunnah. Forget all this 1,400 years of bickering over the meanings of these things. The problem with that is that there's a reason why the tradition is there. If you read Augustine on Christian doctrine, he makes very similar arguments to our scholars about the necessity of mastering certain tools before you can even interact with the tradition. The least of which being grammar. And we have very few people that have mastered the grammar of the Quran. We have people giving commentary of the Quran that are completely unqualified, and in any other previous time, they would be in blocks. You know, they used to have those blocks, they put people, their head and arm, they would be in blocks. In our history, one of the intriguing aspects of our tradition is there are actually very few tafsirs of Quran. And if you look at the men that made tafsir, they were literally the greatest scholars in the history of Islam, because nobody wanted to touch the Quran. It's like, I'm not going to say what I think God means by that. Not me. And then when you read the tafsirs, they become very tedious because they just quote the previous tafsirs. It's very interesting. They all just quote, like you'll read 10 tafsirs and they say the exact same thing because they're all going back to Tabari. Because they just didn't want to mess with the Quran. Mughni al-Labib by Ibn Hisham is one of the most important books in our civilization, is a book, a 2-volume book, just on the meanings of the particles and prepositions in the Quran, in the Arabic language. Because there's so many different types of fa. There's different types of lam. لِيَتَّخِذُهُ عَدُوًّا. In order for him to take him as an enemy, Moses, Pharaoh took him into the house to take him as an enemy. That lam can be ta'lil, but in that case it's not, because nobody in their right mind would take somebody into their house to be their enemy. So it's called lam al-aqiba. It's the lam of consequence. In other words, he didn't know that was what was going to happen, but that's what he was doing. Learning those nuances, and then diction and word choice takes years to master in the Arabic language, because these words are very subtle and they have very subtle meanings. And there are words in the Quran that you might think mean one thing, but then when you read the tafsir, you find out it's completely different meaning from the one that you thought. And that's happened to me many, many times reading the Quran, where I thought I clearly understood what it meant. Then when I went into the tafsir, I realized my understanding was completely skewed. And so tradition, we have to grapple with tradition, but we need the tools to grapple with the tradition. And that's where we're in trouble, because it takes many, many years to master those tools. It takes an incredible amount of intellectual gifts to master them, and it also demands a type of divine inspiration, that it's not something you could just do on your own. There has to be a tawfiq involved in it. And so that adds to the challenge. But Sheikh Abdullah he mastered the Arabic language. I mean, he is arguably one of the great masters of the Arabic language in this time. And in fact, I saw him in a debate with one of the scholars from Pakistan, who's a very, very great Hanafi jurist. And he was arguing with him about, hum ummatum ma'al mu'minin. And he said the ma'a, it doesn't mean they're from the same ummah. It's saying he's with them. And Sheikh Abdullah started arguing from the Quran of the different meanings of ma' in the Arabic language. And one of them is for musahaba. Ana ma'ak, I'm with you. It could also mean indi. Ma'ya khamsatu dananir. I have 5 dinars with me. So there's different meanings, but he was saying it's a valid interpretation to say that it's for musahaba, istishab, that the ummah is one. The Jews and the Arabs in Medina were one ummah. Anyway, but the other thing that he really has mastered is usul al-fiqh. And he knows the great textbooks of our tradition. And so in trying to grapple with what's happening, and one of the things, because we're in such an enlightened age, and there's so many brilliant commentators on the internet that are always enlightening us with their amazing insights and their impeccable grammatically sound syntax. But one of the things that people, like, why are you just talking about the minorities? What about all the majorities, right? And part of something that we have to understand as Muslims is that when Muslims fight amongst each other, that's just Muslims fighting amongst each other. But when they oppress minorities in the name of Islam, that's a blemish on the religion, when they're doing it in the name of the religion. And this is about our religion, which is not the property of the Muslim community. And we have a type of tribalism. There's a tribal mentality, what I call Banu Islam. This idea that this is my tribe. And the Sahaba were all converts, lest you forget, right? They were converts to the religion. So this idea that this is somehow the possession of the Arabs, or the possession of the Saudis, or the possession of ISIS, or the possession of the Pakistanis, or the Turks, or any other ethnicity. No, this is a religion that has an open invitation to humanity. فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ, whoever wants to believe, let him believe. Whoever wants to disbelieve, let him disbelieve. But it's an open invitation. And there's very clear verses in the Quran that if you turn away from it, God will bring other people and they won't be like you. Like, if you're not going to live up to this faith, you'll be replaced with other people. Because the human project is predicated on worship of the Creator. If there's no sound worship, there's no reason for the project to go on. And it ends when that stops. The Prophet ﷺ said, the end of time will not come until there's no one left on the earth to say God. So the atheists win. Right? Dawkins and all these people, they'll be happy to know that in this world, they win. And you can see the way things are going. It would appear that that's the way things are going, because more and more people are abandoning faith, seeing it as a problem instead of a solution, seeing it as a sickness instead of a healing, seeing it as an obstacle instead of the remover of obstacles. So he, in thinking about this revival of dhimmitude and sexual slavery, concubinage, and these things that, for instance, Graham Wood in his article using Bernard Haeckel as a foundation argues that these Muslims that think that ISIS isn't following their religion, they just have a distorted version of their religion. And this is basically Graham Wood's argument in that Atlantic Monthly article, that what they were doing, or what they're doing in Syria and Iraq, is actually from Islam. It's not an anomaly. They're just practicing things that Muslims haven't been practicing for 1,000 years. And people like Glenn Beck, who's written a book recently, it's number 3, last time I looked, number 3 bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list, called The Problem Is Islam, argues that there are many, many good Muslims, but they're not good because they're Muslim, they're good because they're not practicing Islam. Right? And so we're getting large numbers of people being indoctrinated into this idea somehow that our religion is a death cult, and arguably a death cult has emerged within our religion. This whole idea, you know, ash-shahadatu ghayatuna, this slogan that martyrdom is our goal, that's not the goal of Muslims. That's not the goal. The Prophet said, "La tatamannu liqa al-adu." He said, also don't ask for death, right? And if there was a better way to die than in the arms of your wife in your bed, then he would have died that way. That's where he died. He didn't die on the battlefield. Less than 0.1% of Sahaba actually died on the battlefield. It's a very small number of the Sahaba actually died on the battlefield. So this kind of cult of death that has emerged within the religion is actually very alien to the Islamic tradition. And he asked about who the martyr was, and they said the martyr is the one who dies fi sabilillah. And he said, then the martyrs of my ummah would be very few. That's in a sahih hadith. But he said the martyr is the one who dies when a building collapses on him, or when he falls off his camel, or when he gets dysentery, or when he drowns. There's lots of ways to be a martyr. So in grappling with this, Sheikh Abdullah came up with this idea of reviving the Constitution of Medina. Sometimes it's referred to as the Constitution of Medina, Sahifat al-Medina. The Constitution of Medina, for want of a better word, was an agreement in which the Prophet, when he came to Medina, he was invited by some of the Aus and the Khazraj, but he was not in full power. He had very few followers at that time. There were several Jewish tribes in Medina. There were three major ones, which all of us know, Bani Qaynuqa, Bani Nadir, and Bani Qurayza. And he entered into a treaty in the first year of Hijrah with them, a muwada'a, in which they would all agree in their own religious expressions to work towards righteousness and to defend one another. And this was a pact. But what's interesting about the pact is it had equal rights in terms of citizenship. And Imam Shafi'i said, this is an agreement of our community. One of the most intriguing aspects of this constitution is that even the most skeptical of Orientalists actually believe that this is an authentic legal document. Patricia Crone, who died a few years back, one of the Hagarites, accepted it. Fred Donor, somebody who's worked a lot on the origins of Islam, accepted it. There's a few different recensions that are found. Ibn Ishaq, in his Sirah, has a copy. We don't have any original copy, but we do know that it was a valid document. And what I spoke on in Marrakesh, I mean, Sheikh Abdullah did his, he gave his kalima ta'siliya, what he calls ta'siliya, which is giving it a foundational basis in the tradition, where he looks at all the different texts. He looks at, he's got mafahim, mutarabbisa, these concepts that are misunderstood, like jihad, jizya, dhimma, arguing that, that these are really misunderstood concepts in our tradition. And the thing about what's important to remember about Sheikh Abdullah is that he is not a modernist by any stretch. He is very much embedded in tradition, but he's a creative traditionalist. And one of the things about Toynbee, Arnold Toynbee, the great English historian, who wrote a study in history, 9-volume study of history, where he studied 21 civilizations, why they rose, how they maintained their power, why they began to decline, and why they collapsed. And argues that out of those 21 civilizations that he studied, there were only 7 living civilizations today. But what he argues in there is that civilizations are confronted with challenges, And if they have creative minorities that can grapple with these challenges, they're able to withstand the challenges and sometimes overcome them, surmount them. But when the challenges become insurmountable due to a dearth of these creative thinkers, then the civilization collapses. And this is one of the real trying aspects of our civilization right now. We have very few creative people. Most of the people in power, I don't think, could get middle managerial jobs at corporations with their qualifications. A lot of them, and I've read the SAT scores that they have on a lot of these people in the Senate and Congress, and it's embarrassing. I mean, they weren't even good in school. Like Dan Quayle said, if I knew I would have got this far, I would have studied harder. You know, and that is a case against democracy. It's a case for monarchy, because at least they know they're going to be in power. So anyway, I'll just go through some of the things that I looked at. Islam al-Mutasamih, tolerant Islam. One of the verses in Surah Al-Hajj, it's a very important verse. I mean, everything's important, but this, لَوْلَا دَفَعُ اللَّهِ النَّاسَ أو دفاع الله in Warsh. الناس بعضهم ببعض لهدمت or هدمت in Warsh صوامع وبيع وصلوات ومساجد يذكر فيها اسم الله كثيرا ولا ينصرن الله من ينصره إن الله لقوي عزيز. Had it not been for God using some people to defend other people, you would have seen the صوامع, the churches, the biy'un, the temples, the salawatun, so the monasteries, the churches, and the synagogues, and then the masajid, wherein God's name is oft mentioned. And then the ulama differ. Does it go back to masajid? The damir, is it a'id ala masajid, or is it a'id ala all of them? You know, and I think it makes more sense to say it goes back to all of them, because these are places where the God of Abraham certainly is being worshipped. And Allah says, "Ta'alu ila kalimatin sawa'in baynana wa baynakum." You know, this is a word we share. One of these recent debates at Wheaton College, that courageous lady who said that, you know, we worship the same God, and she's right. But the concept of the God differs. The God is the Lord of the heavens and the earth, the creator and sustainer of the heavens and the earth. We can differ on how we conceptualize that God, but the God is the same God. In the same way, if you look at, I mean, it's a poor analogy, but you have Republicans and Democrats. Both of them believe in government, but they have very different concepts of what government should be, right? And so people differ in their conceptualization of ideas, but the idea of God is the same. And one of the things about our tradition, like the Catholics call it the via negativa, you know, the negating way, which is the way of the unknowable God. And certainly if you read Aquinas on God, even Aquinas on the Trinity, it's very clear that the Catholics believe in a God that cannot be temporal, cannot be in place, is not complex, is of simple reality. I mean, these are understandings that the Christian theologians had centuries ago. So the idea, and then obviously the Logos and the Incarnation, those are all mysteries in that tradition, but the God, which is behind the personas, what Meister Eckhart calls the Godhead, is the unknowable God, right? The God of in the Vedic tradition, they call it the God of the Nirguna, you know, the God that's attributeless, that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. You know, so there's, in our tradition, we believe that God is that which is unlike anything. In fact, jawazu itlaq al-shay' ala Allah is majaz. To call God a thing is only majaz. It's because out of adab we can't say he's no thing. But he's not a thing. God is not a thing. Because the word in Arabic for thing is shay, which means willed into existence. Shay'an. Right? The shay already is in the mashi'ah. So all these things that Allah have created, they're already embedded in our language, is a metaphysic of creation. But we call God a thing out of adab to say that he's not no thing, but there is no thing like him. Laysa kamithlihi shay'un. There is no shay like God. But Al-Bukhari has a chapter called the permissibility of saying, using thing to talk about God. So this is the God that we worship, the unknowable God. But he has revealed himself to us through language, and that language is problematic. Because language always creates ambiguities. It's not like mathematics, which is the language of numbers. It's the language of ideas and concepts. And you can't pin them down. The more you pin down a concept, the more elusive it becomes. And so Allah is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, but any number over infinity is canceled out. So anything you can think about God's mercy is canceled out, but he's given us mercy in the world to let us know something about his mercy. It's an approximation. It's taqrib al-ma'ani. It's to approximate these meanings to our consciousness. So had it not been, then all these religious places would be destroyed. So this permissibility for fighting, which came in Surah Al-Hajj, was in defense of religious institutions. So the jihad, right? أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا. These people have been given permission to defend themselves because they were oppressed for their religion. So the actual illah, the legal rationale for jihad initially was purely religious persecution. And obviously it extends to any forms of oppression. And so if you look at the Fatra Makkiyah, it's a period of religious persecution. So the Prophet of all people knew firsthand what it was like to be persecuted for your religion. He tasted the pain of that reality. And what's interesting and intriguing about the pagans in Mecca is they were worried about the economic impact that monotheism would have on their trade and commerce. Like they never thought that people one day would come from Indonesia or from California to go to Mecca. In those days, it was just the Arab tribes that were going. But they thought, these tribes are coming because they've got idols in the Kaaba. If he gets his way, all these idols are going to be destroyed. Who's going to come? The Jews and the Christians aren't going to come. They have Jerusalem. So we're going to be stuck here without any revenue. And that was the mentality of these people. Because they really didn't have a problem with adding another God. But if you said only one God and la ilaha, there's no other God, illallah, that troubled them. And so the Prophet ﷺ, during this persecution, they first went to the Najashi. And one of the things that I think Muslims forget is that we have 3 sunan from our Prophet. The sunnah of powerlessness, which is the sunnah of Mecca. And this sunnah is not abrogated, but the Muslims act as if it's been abrogated. If you say that it's abrogated, that means his 13 years in Mecca have no real meaning. Like all that suffering he went through, all that patience, sabran ya al-yasir inna maw'idukum al-jannah, all those things don't really have any meaning to us anymore. They're just a historical fact. So that sunnah is just has no meaning to us. That's basically what people are saying when they say that the Meccan period's over. The Meccan period's never over. If the conditions in which the Meccan period occurred return, then the same sunnah of Mecca returns. And even Ibn Taymiyyah said that. So the second sunnah is the sunnah of, because remember, sunnah is his aqwal, his af'al, and his iqrarat. It's what he deems correct. So the next sunnah is how to live in a non-Muslim society that's not persecuting you. And that's the sunnah of Ethiopia, of Habasha. They were allowed to practice their faith. And the last sunnah is the sunnah of when you have sovereignty, when God has empowered you, again, figuratively, because all power, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, when God puts you in a position in which you're representing His power, because all power is God's. So in that type of situation, how do you behave? And again, the magnanimity that He showed. So then he made his hijrah to Medina. After 13 years of persecution, he makes this hijrah. He attempted to go, he was thinking about going to Hajar in eastern Arabia. He went to different tribes, asking them if they would take him. He used to kind of ya'ridu nafsu ala al-qaba'il. He used to go and ask for tribal protection. None of them helped him. And finally, the Aus and the Khazraj, who were in a town called Yathrib, and these were two Yemeni tribes. They're Kahlani. The Yemenis are divided into Himyaris and Kahlanis. They were Kahlani Yemenites who left after the famous dam broke, and many of the Yemenites went to Syria and different places. They went to Medina, Yathrib at the time. And the Aus and the Khazraj are Banu Ayla. They were from the same ancestor, so they're actually one family. But like the Hatfields and the McCoys, families feud. And so they began to feud. And they had allies from amongst the Jews. So the Aus had their allies and the Khazraj had their allies. And right before the Prophet came, they had a war called Harb al-Bu'ath, in which they fought each other. And Qurayza was involved and Nadir was involved. So the Jews used to tell them, you know, there's a prophet coming. That's why we're here. He's coming to this city. When he comes, he's going to get rid of all your idols. And they used to hear this. And one of the intriguing aspects of the Arabs in Medina is that if they had a really sick child, they would swear an oath to God because they believed in Allah as the supreme God. They would swear an oath that they'll raise it a Jew if it lives. And so there were actually several Jewish Arab children in Medina. And La Ikraha fi Din was revealed because some of them wanted to force their children to be Muslim, even though they were Arabs who had raised them as Jews, because they had very high regard for the Jews because they were people of the book. And they used to ask them for things, even though they didn't convert to Judaism. They would ask them. And so the Quran was revealed. You can't compel them to convert to Islam. They leave them in their Judaism unless they want to convert to Islam. That's one of the asbab that's mentioned. So the Jews in Medina, there were probably, I mean, these estimates are hard, but there were probably around 30,000. There were more Jews than there were Arabs in Medina. And the Jews had primarily, they were agriculturalists, and they controlled the souk. And Banu Qaynuqa in particular had control over the marketplace. And so the Arabs and the Jews who were farmers used to bring their crops to the Banu Qaynuqa, and then they would buy them and sell them in the marketplace to Arabs that would come. And then they were also goldsmiths and money lenders. So these were the occupations. So when the first thing that the Prophet did was he asked about the souk. And they said, it's Banu Qaynuqa's. And he said, the Muslims should have their own souk. Right? So this is his economic foresight. And so he actually has set up a separate market, which obviously would have angered Banu Qaynuqa, because they would have seen that as breaking their monopoly. But that's what he did. And his souk was very interesting because it was more like what we would call today a flea market. He did not allow anybody to own a stall. It was first come, first serve. So you couldn't get like the best place. And it was, if you got there the earliest, you got the best place. And so it was a very egalitarian marketplace. And so the first thing he did was he built a souk and he built the masjid. Those were the first two acts that he did. His first khutbah, which Abdullah bin Salam, the Jewish rabbi, heard, he got everybody together in Medina. He said, Ya ayyuhan nas, أفشوا السلام, spread peace. وأطعموا الطعام, and feed food. Feed food. وصلوا الأرحام, and maintain your kinship bonds. And remember, that's a deep statement in relation to Aus and Khazraj, as well as the Jews that were at war with each other. Maintain your kinship bonds. Don't fight. You're all related to each other. Maintain those bonds. وَصَلُّوا بِاللَّيْلِ وَالنَّاسُ النِّيَامِ تَدْخُلُ الْجَنَّةَ بِالسَّلَامِ. And pray at some portion of the night when people are sleeping, and you'll enter into paradise with peace. So it begins with peace and it ends with peace. That's his first khutbah. Begins with peace and it ends with peace. So in Medina, he establishes the masjid and the marketplace. And Banu Qaynuqa, even though they entered into an agreement, begin to have talks with the Quraysh. And so this is the beginning of the breakdown of the Sahifa. They have, and they give them basically aid at Badr. And so they are expelled to, he allows them to take all of their wealth, and they went to Khaybar. But it's important to note, at this time the Prophet is very weak. There's probably less than 2,000 men that he has. The Jews were more powerful than he was, and the Banu Qaynuqa was expecting Qurayza and Nadir to come to his aid, and they didn't, which indicates that they recognized that what they did was breaking the treaty. And many of the Jews were very upright. They were honest people, and they were people of their word. And the Prophet mentioned that about especially Mukhayriq and others, Rifa'a. And we know the Arabs have a saying, Awfa min Samaw'al, more trustworthy than Samaw'al, more trustworthy than Samuel, who was the famous Jew that would not give up the armor of Imr al-Qais, who left it as a trust with him and actually lost his child because of that. And he's the famous poet, Jahili poet as well. So these are the tribes, the Yahud of Banu Zurayq, Banu Amr, Banu Sa'ida, Banu Jusham, Banu Najjar, Banu Auf, Banu Tha'laba. Tha'laba Mukhayriq was from Tha'laba bin Fiqyan. This is a Jewish tribe. So Muslims only know the tribe, and that should be Shutayba with a ta. Muslims only know the three tribes, but these are all Jews mentioned in the Sahifa. So there were many Jews in Medina that did not break their trust, and you can see the dominant tribes, Bani Qurayza, that should be a dha, not a dha. And then Bani Qaynuqa, Bani Nadir, and then there was this is later, right? Medina was actually protected by these lava tracks. And anybody who's ever seen the lava tracks, it's almost impossible to walk on them. They're quite dangerous because they're very sharp. You can't take animals across them. That's why the trench was such a useful way of protecting Medina, because Medina was literally surrounded by, in fact, in Arabic it's called laba, with a ba. It's like this Israeli lady recently said, Palestine doesn't exist because the Arabs don't have a P in their language. So they don't have a V either. They say ba. So lava is actually laba, is the Arabic word. Palestine. So, yeah. Buffoon has a B, so that'll work. So this is a very important event. Imam Shafi'i said, لم أعلم مخالفا من أهل العلم بالسير أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لما نزل بالمدينة وادع اليهود كافة على غير جزية. I know of no one from amongst the people of prophetic biography that differ that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he came to Medina, he entered into an alliance with all of the Jews without jizya. Now, at Ghazwat Uhud, Banu Tha'laba refused to go out because they said it was Sabt, and the only one that went out was Mukhayriq. There were 2 Jews that fought at Uhud, and Mukhayriq was killed. Mukhayriq, there's a khilaf about whether he became Muslim or not. Ibn Ishaq says, آمن ولم يسلم فقد غلب عليه إلف دينه. He believed in Allah, but he didn't become Muslim because he was just too accustomed to his own religion. But he told the Jews, we made a promise to defend the Prophet, we should do it. He went out, he fought, he was actually martyred, and he left all of his property with the Jews to give to the Prophet. And the first endowment in Islam came from the wealth of Mukhayriq, according to one tradition. And the Prophet said about him, Mukhayriq khayrul yahud. He's the best of the Jews. And then you have Ghazwat al-Ahzab. So in the 5th year, the Jews of Khaybar, and Khaybar was it's right, I think 60 kilometers from Medina, around there. Khaybar was an agricultural oasis where the Jews lived and they worked, and they had a lot of date orchards there, and they weren't united. They had several utum, and the utum are these sayasi, they're called in the Quran, these fortresses. And Bani Nadir, the leadership of Bani Nadir, Huyay ibn al-Akhtab, Kinana ibn Rabi' ibn Huqayq, they were in Khaybar stirring up and convincing them that we need to get the ally with the Quraysh, with Fazara, with Ghatafan, and these Arab tribes in the area, Bani Sulaym, and just deal with this once and for all. So they actually amassed an alliance of about 10,000. And this is Ghazwat al-Ahzab in the 5th year. And so they march on Medina. This really isn't a battle, it's a skirmish, because they never fight. About 10 people died altogether, despite the fact they were there for almost a month. And Nu'aym begins to sow dissension amongst them. But during that time, the Nadiri leadership goes to Bani Qurayza, the leadership of Bani Qurayza. And initially, the leadership of Bani Qurayza doesn't want to have anything to do with it. They actually helped dig the trench. They didn't want to be involved in treachery. But they were convinced by Huyay ibn al-Akhtab that we've got 10,000 people, this is it. The Muslims at the time only had 3,000 men, that's all. And they were not well armed. And so they really thought they could take care of it. And he was very convincing, he was a very powerful leader, and he convinced Ka'b ibn al-Asad al-Quradi to ally with them. And so this is the treasonous event that occurs during the skirmish of al-Ahzab. And they really wanted to annihilate the Muslims. So this was kind of a genocidal attempt at ridding the peninsula of the Muslims. And so the Quraysh leave, Ghatafan leaves, all of the Arab tribes leave, and they're left with Bani Qurayza are in their utam. A handful of them actually went out to fight. Now, what happens after that is very murky to me. I've read several accounts of it. I went through all the Sirah literature on it. I read Barakat Ahmed's book. I read Kistar's work, the Israeli historian, which is a very pretty serious piece of scholarship arguing against Barakat Ahmed's book. But I'm still convinced that it's grossly exaggerated, the numbers, and there's nothing sound on that. The only thing in al-Bukhari that Sa'd ibn Mu'adh said that the muqatila should be killed, and the dharari, wal nisa, And Surah Al-Ahzab clearly says, فَرِيقًا تَقْتُلُونَ وَتَأْسِرُونَ فَرِيقًا. I mean, the Quran is very clear that some people were killed and some were taken captive. That did occur. It's undeniable. But the numbers, and if you look at the event, it just doesn't smack, it doesn't sound. All the prisoners were kept in the house of Bint al-Harith. I asked Sheikh Abdullah al-Qadi, who knows all the houses of Medina inside out, because they were all very well studied. And I asked him how many people could be held in a house like that. He said it's a small house, maybe 10. And if you read also the idea of digging a ditch in the middle of the marketplace of Medina, it just doesn't make sense. There's several things in that narrative that I find really, really problematic. But anyway, it's there, and I don't think any numbers should be mentioned because we just don't know. And Imam Malik did not accept Ibn Ishaq as a muhaddith. He was not a muhaddith. He was a student of Zuhri. They actually chased him out of Medina. He's the source. He did an incredible service to Islam, and that goes undiminished. But he was not a solid source in hadith. And the rigor of Malik in particular is well established. Malik did not like to use anything that smacked of weakness. And so, the numbers are definitely problematic. But what happens then is that the Prophet goes and he makes a sulh al-Hudaybiyah. And what's really intriguing about this event is they go to make Umrah, but they're not allowed to make the Umrah. And they meet at Hudaybiyah, and the Quraysh send out a wafd. Uthman goes in to speak with them. They send out a wafd, and they're going to debate about what's going to happen. So they come to some agreements, but all of the points the Prophet compromises. Literally every single point. He just compromised. Even Muhammad Rasulullah, they said, we don't accept that. And he told Ali to erase it. And Ali said, I can't do it. That's the Sufiya call that mukhalafat ad-dubiyya. It's like disobeying the Prophet out of adab to the Prophet. Like he just said, I can't erase it. And so the Prophet said, show me where it is. And he pointed to it. And the Prophet himself erased Rasulullah and just said, this is an agreement between Muhammad ibn Abdullah and Quraysh. Because the Quraysh said, we don't accept that. So he said, not a problem. Get rid of it. Every single point. The Sahaba were so distraught at this, and they said, everybody wavered except Abu Bakr. Even Umar ibn al-Khattab. He went to Abu Bakr and he said, Alaysa Rasulullah? Isn't he the messenger of God? What are we doing? Why are we? They all had their weapons. They were ready to fight. Why are we compromising like this? Abu Bakr, he grabbed him. He said, he reminded him and just shook him to his core. The Prophet ﷺ went in. He asked Salama what he should do. She said, look, cut your hair, go out and sacrifice. Just give them some sense of closure on their pilgrimage. So he did that, and then they saw that, and they did that, and they felt better. On the way back, Inna fatahna laka fatahan mubina. That's what's revealed. Like, this is a big opening. What's the opening? Compromise in every situation. The opening was peace. This is the first time in the history of his message where he's actually got peace. Because the Jews now, he goes to Khaybar, and he defeats them at Khaybar and enters into a treaty with them. They promised the Ahzab half the date harvest, so he entered into a treaty that they would take half the date harvest, or they could leave and go to Syria. They choose. They decided to choose to stay. So they entered into a contract with them that it would be a non-belligerent treaty of non-belligerence. This is the first time the Prophet has peace. From here on, from the 6th year on, all you see is people becoming Muslim. Zuhri said that ما فتح في الإسلام فتح قبله كان أعظم منه. No fath before this was greater than this fath. This is an opening that was a peaceful opening. There was no fighting, and it's called a victory. It was a non-violent victory. And this was the greatest victory, second to the opening of Mecca, which was also a non-violent victory. So the two greatest victories of the Prophet were victories of non-violence. إِنَّمَا كَانَ الْقِتَالُ حَيْثُ الْتَقَى النَّاسِ. People would fight every time they met. فَلَمَّا كَانَتِ الْهُدْنَةُ. When they finally had peace, وَوُضِعَتِ الْحَرْبُ. And they stopped fighting, وَآمَنَ النَّاسِ بَعْضُهُمْ بَعْضًا. And people felt safe from one another. وَالْتَقَوْا فَتَفَاوَضُوا. They'd meet and then they'd start discussing. فِي الْحَدِيثِ وَالْمُنَازَعَةِ. And debating. فَلَمْ يُكَلَّمْ أَحَدٌ بِالْإِسْلَامِ يَعْقِلُ شَيْئًا إِلَّا دَخَلَ فِيهِ. So nobody that was just talked to about Islam that had any brains, except that he would embrace Islam after that. وَلَقَدْ دَخَلَ فِي تَيْنِكَ السَّنَتَيْنِ. In those 2 years, more people became Muslim than in the previous 19. It's amazing. So, you know, and then what time is it?
It's 12:36.
Okay, I'm going to stop there, and maybe we'll finish this another day. Yeah, so I'll just leave some questions because I have an interview that I have to go to. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask or comments.
Assalamu alaikum. At the very beginning, you mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ told us that Islam would only exist as a polity for 30 years.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether that is a statement that you'd recommend to us as like explaining to people when they either look at things in Islamic history or governments that call themselves Islamic and are doing things that are not following the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Do you think that that's something that non-Muslims could hear and understand and give them, you know, a little bit more wisdom as to how to understand what's happening?
I mean, I don't know what people or how people react. There's so many variables when you talk to people, background, education. I mean, the word in Arabic for khilaf, difference of opinion, is the word, it's derived from a word that has to do with background, khalafa, what you leave behind. So khalfiyya is your background. So khilafs come from different backgrounds. You know, we're in, you know, Black History Month. I mean, there's all these people in America, white people, that say things like, you know, why can't blacks just get over it? But they never define it. Like 500 years being stripped of your heritage, of your history, of your name, being, you know, subjugated, being treated like animals. They were actually categorized as like livestock, you know, and that went on until, you know, 1865 or 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, but it takes 100 years to legislate civil rights from that, and we're still not there. We don't have an African American as president. There's African American as first lady, but we have a Kenyan American as president. He's not African American. He's an East African, right? From the Luo tribe, too, which in Kenya he couldn't even get elected, which is pretty amazing, right? That's what happened to his father. His father went back to Kenya, and there was no upward mobility because of his tribal background. And that's part of the problem in the Muslim world and in Africa as well, is that, you know, families determine so much. There's no upward mobility. There's no meritocracy. I mean, the first thing a Syrian asks you, you know, Beit Min. Which house are you from? And right when you tell them, boom, you've been identified. You know, you're either from a good family or from another type of family. And it doesn't allow for upward mobility. It doesn't allow for meritocracy. The Prophet tried to eliminate all that stuff. Judge people according to the content of their character, not according to their tribe, clan, family, wealth, or lineage. You know, that's how people should be judged. So, I don't know. You know, I mean, we have to embrace the dark. You know, we have a shadow in our religion. There's every religion, you know, Dr. Winters says that the history of a religion is the history of its ego. And we tend to forget that there's a lot of darkness in our history. There's a lot of beautiful things. And in many ways, in terms of the pre-modern world, Muslims have nothing to be ashamed of. It's quite stunning what they were able to accomplish given the prevailing attitudes in most parts of the world. Many of the things that the Prophet taught were the dreams of philosophers. And they became common coin. The Muslims have always had racism, but they've never had a racism that prevented somebody from eating with another person. They never had that type of racism. There's no history where they would not put their hand in a plate that had a white hand or a black hand in it. I mean, they just didn't have that type of racism. But we have a lot of dark things in our history, in our past. And our religion, our tradition has a lot of horrible things that they're there. And they're in the books. And I've read them. I've spent 30 years reading in our tradition. And I've seen stuff that really bothered me. But it's there. And we have to deal with it. But does it represent the ethos or the spirit of Islam or the spirit of the Prophet? I would argue that it doesn't. And so, but then there's things that certainly that happened at the time of the Prophet that are very troubling for modern people. That's going to be undeniable. Concubinage is something that modern people cannot get their heads around at all. It's very, very difficult for people to grapple with that concept, but that was a prevailing concept, not just amongst Muslims, but amongst most of the civilizations of the pre-modern world. So, and we certainly have types of it now. It's just criminal activity, right? I mean, there's probably more concubinage today than at any other time in human history. It's not regulated. It has no, there's no rights. There's no, so.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh.
Alaikum salam.
When you made mention of that mentality of those that have this, Banu Islam, what, maybe even in your opinion or an approach that we can take now, would be to kind of change that?
Well, one of the things that's really interesting to me, when I read Arnold's book on the preaching of Islam, he says that Muslims were actively engaged in spreading their religion until the end of the Khilafah. At late 19th century, it just stopped spreading. There was very little done. And I just thought that was really interesting, that Muslims always had missionaries. They usually came out of the Sufis. I mean, even Ibn Taymiyyah writes that the Mubtadi'ah amongst the Sufis did great service by spreading Islam in places no one else wanted to go to. Because they would go, they went to the Bogomils. I mean, Albania became Muslim over centuries. The Turks arrived there in the 15th century, but it took several hundred years before they really, and they're still, the Albanians, the Arnaut, they're still very nationalistic as a people, but it took a long time. Egypt, according to Khalid Blankenship, who I trust, did not reach 50% for the first 300 years. It was mostly Christian. Syria did not reach 50% for the first 500 years. Andalusia never reached 50%. There was always a majority of Christians. And so Muslims have this fantasy that, the Muslims just showed up and everybody said, Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. It doesn't work like that. They lived with these people of different religions. And they treated them sometimes well and other times not so well, and sometimes better than other places treated minorities. And sometimes they did horrible things. So they're human. But overall, our tradition just, I think, and the Prophet inculcated this in his Sahaba, he had an incredible tolerance for idiosyncrasies and bizarre behavior, and he really tolerated people as they were. And that's why he had some crazy people around him that are clear in the seerah. He had jokesters, like Nu'ayman is a clear jokester, and the Prophet tolerated him, He went and bought him all these gifts and brought him, and then the man shows up and he said, you owe me some money to the Prophet. He said, why? He said, Nu'ayman said that you were going to pay for these. So And he allowed for different, the one thing that he really did not like was religious extremism, really bothered him. The Prophet was very bothered by ghulu. Even in ibadah, he did not like people to do excessive ibadah, like too much fasting, too much. He was very temperate and moderate. Dhikr is another thing, doing a lot of dhikr, but doing, you know, the kind of, he said, la rahbaniyata fil Islam. There's no monkery in Islam. So he was very wary of that. He didn't like extremism. But, you know, when we were at the conference in Marrakesh, and the Imam al-Haramain was there, Abdul Fattah bin Nis, one of the great munshideen of Morocco, got up and sang. He sang, and then Sami Yusuf got up and sang. Well, one of the Christian ladies from the evangelical tradition, she got up and she just burst into song, you know. And I saw these ulama in the front were kind of like, you know. And I mentioned it later to Sheikh Abdullah, and he said, "Khaliha tughani," yani let her sing. He's just not uptight. You know, it's just let people be who they are. You know, as long as they're not like harming or, you know. So anyway.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Hamza. Can we take one question from online?
Yeah.
I'm just here in the back.
Yeah.
And this is actually related to something you just mentioned, but if you have any other remarks or summary regarding the essence of what took place in Marrakesh in terms of the meeting.
You know, the Sheikh had the actual declaration. He wrote a very serious paper on framing, but then he did the declaration, which, you know, whereas the conditions in various parts of the Muslim world have deteriorated dangerously due to the use of violence and armed struggle as a tool for settling conflicts and imposing one's point of view, whereas this situation has also weakened the authority of legitimate governments and enabled criminal groups to issue edicts attributed to Islam, but which in fact alarmingly distort its fundamental principles and goals in ways that have seriously harmed the population as a whole, whereas this marks the 1400th anniversary of the Charter of Medina, a constitutional contract between the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the peoples of Medina, which guaranteed the religious liberty of all regardless of faith, whereas hundreds of Muslim scholars and intellectuals from over 120 countries, along with representatives of Islamic and international organizations, as well as leaders from diverse religious groups and nationalities, gathered in Marrakesh on this date to reaffirm the principles of the Charter. And so we declare our firm commitment to the principles articulated in the Charter of Medina, whose provisions contained a number of principles of constitutional contractual citizenship, such as freedom of movement, property ownership, mutual solidarity and defense, as well as principles of justice and equality before the law, and that the objectives of the Charter of Medina provide a suitable framework for national constitutions in countries with Muslim majorities, and the United Nations Charter and related documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are in harmony with the Charter of Medina, including consideration for public order. Noting further that deep reflection upon various crises afflicting humanity underscores the inevitable and urgent need for cooperation among all religious groups, we affirm hereby that such cooperation must be based on a common word, requiring that such cooperation must go beyond mutual tolerance and respect to providing full protection for the rights and liberties to all religious groups in a civilized manner that eschews coercion, bias, and arrogance. Based on all the above, we hereby call upon Muslim scholars and intellectuals around the world to develop a jurisprudence of the concept of citizenship which is inclusive of diverse groups. Such jurisprudence shall be rooted in Islamic tradition and principles of mindful global changes. Urge Muslim educational institutions and authorities to conduct a courageous review of educational curricula that addresses honestly and effectively any material that instigates aggression and extremism, leads to war and chaos, and results in the destruction of our shared societies. And calling upon politicians and decision makers to take the political and legal steps necessary to establish a constitutional contractual relationship among its citizens and to support all formulations and initiatives that aim to fortify relations and understanding amongst the various religious groups in the Muslim world. We call upon educated, artistic, and creative members of our societies, as well as organizations of civil society, to establish a broad movement for the just treatment of religious minorities in Muslim countries and to raise awareness as to their rights and work together to ensure the success of these efforts. We call upon the various religious groups bound by the same national fabric to address their mutual state of selective amnesia that blocks memories of centuries of joint and shared living on the same land. We call upon them to rebuild the past by reviving this tradition of conviviality and restoring our shared trust that has been eroded by extremists using acts of terror and aggression. We call upon representatives of the various religions, sects, and denominations to confront all forms of religious bigotry, vilification, and denigration of what people hold sacred, as well as all speech that promotes hatred and bigotry. And finally, affirm that it is unconscionable to employ religion for the purpose of aggressing upon the rights of religious minorities in Muslim countries. So that's the declaration. And we had a Yazidi there who, yeah, you know, and he said to me, I spoke to him afterwards, and he just said, listen, nobody in our community attributes this to Islam. You know, he said, we've been living with Muslims for hundreds of years. And the Sabians said the same thing. The Druze said the same thing. You know, so, in fact, the most painful cry came from the head of the Sunnis of Iraq. You know, so, but it was important, you know, and they all shared the Christian. We had the Christian Catholic Archbishop. We had the cardinal from the Catholic tradition. We had a bishop from the Palestinian Church, you know, also affirming that Muslims have treated the Christians in the Holy Lands well for centuries. I mean, a book I recently read, which I found fascinating, are the Syriac sources that really haven't been looked at. This is the first time they've been translated into English. But historically, what people did when they looked at the early period, like Fred Donner, they looked at the Byzantine sources, but the Byzantines were oppressing a lot of these religious minorities. But when you look at the actual Malachite church and the Chaldean church and the Nestorian church and the Jacobite church and the Monophysite church, the stuff they say about Islam is totally different. Like, they saw them as liberators, and this is the greatest thing that's happened to this region. And, you know, it's a very different picture that you get from the Byzantine sources. So, anyway, I have to go do this interview. So, سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على